Good morning, everyone. I am Sheila Marie A. Palmares, the reporter for today, and I am going to report is about Japanese occupations. So, Japanese military expansion in the Asia-Pacific region had made confrontation and war with the United States increasingly certain. In preparation for war, on July 26, 1941, General Douglas MacArthur brought the 12,000 strong Philippine Scouts under his command with the 16,000 American soldiers stationed in the Philippines. The attack on the Philippines started on December 8, 1941, 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. As at Pearl Harbor, the American aircraft were entirely destroyed on the ground, and lacking air cover, the American Asiatic fleet in the Philippines withdrew to Java on December 12, 1941. Japanese troops landed at the Lingayen Gulf on December 22, 1941, and advanced across central Luzon towards Manila. On the advice of President Quezon, General MacArthur declared Manila an open city on December 25, 1941, and removed the Commonwealth government to Corregidor. The Japanese occupied Manila on January 2, 1942. So, why did Japan attack the Philippines? First, the Japanese military had this concept of United Asian Sphere like the current European Union, and to achieve this, all foreign occupiers must be expelled in Asia. Second, the Philippines was under American occupation. Japan saw this as an unjust occupation, and they needed to liberate the Philippines from these foreigners. And third, Japan had an ambitious plan to dominate and conquer the whole of East Asia. And fourth, to acquire staging areas and supply bases to enhance operations and to secure communication lines from Japanese home island. How did Japan invaded the Philippines? Great strategic plan of the Japan. Despite the 9-hour warning of the outbreak of hostilities with Japan, the commander of the United States Army and Air Forces in the Philippines, Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur, was paralyzed by indecision during these crucial hours and failed to bring his forces to a state of readiness to meet a Japanese attack. MacArthur's indecision combined with his poor military judgment and slackness in his command structure. It led to the destruction of half of his air force on the ground and his troops being denied adequate supplies to withstand a lengthy siege. Next, Japanese rules for Filipinos, 1941 to 1945. First, salute to the Japanese soldiers when you meet them. Second, the Japanese flag should be displayed at every house's door. Third, everybody must put the sunrise armband on the left arm. And fourth, everybody should have the certificate of residence. And fifth, wherever you see Japanese soldiers, you must welcome them and not escape from them. The escaper will be considered as the enemy. 6. Unless you do not tell false prices, you will be paid reasonable. 7. You are absolutely prohibited to walk until the sunset until the sunrise without carrying lamps. The walker who has not lights will be shot by Japanese patrolling soldier without any warnings. 8. Don't be fooled and bewildered by false propaganda by communists, bandits, and Chinese. 9. The incendiarism, accidental fire, and robbery will be punished. 10. The holding of arms is allowed by the army, but the arms holder must report to the mayor it and get permission. 11. The jobless people can find one's job in Japanese army and will be. 12. Be obedient to the orders of governor and mayor who are authorized. The Japanese influence. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II, the Japanese influenced the government in the Philippines by enforcing a strict curfew, adding Japanese currency, instituting a military government, and reducing neighborhood government system by half. The occupation also cost the lives of over 1 million in the Philippines. The lives of the Filipinos during the occupation. During the occupation of the Japanese in the Philippines, they ran the Philippines with an iron hand. They instilled fear, declared martial law. They imposed curfews. They ordered that anyone who opposes them, or even those who are just accused of going against the Japanese, were punished and killed. Singing of the national anthem and raising of the national flag was prohibited. Use of radios and transmitters was also prohibited. Political parties, elections, and public assemblies were put to a halt. School printing presses, telegraph, and radio stations were closed down. Everything was controlled by the Japanese. Next, road to war. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and provoked an undeclared war with China. It massacred inhabitants of Nanjing, event also known as the Rape of Nanking. It allied itself to the Axis powers. The United States imposed an embargo on oil and scrap metal exports to Japan. Saburo Kurosu, a career diplomat, negotiated peace and understanding with the U.S. while Japan secretly planned attack on Pearl Harbor. Next, preparation for independence and war. President Quezon summoned General Douglas MacArthur, retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S., to prepare the Philippines militarily. He assumed the rank Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. Training of citizen soldiers was undertaken with the implementation of PMT and ROTC. Training was saddled with lack of adequate equipment and ammunition. Filipinos made their own headgears from coconut fibers called ginit. Belts were made from abaca fiber instead of leather. Shoes were manufactured locally by Ang Tibay. Due to growing differences between Quezon and MacArthur, MacArthur asked President Roosevelt to recall him to U.S. service. The Americans allowed false rumors about Japan to circulate the country to assure Filipinos that everything is secure. Next, attacks. Air attacks took place at Baguio, Tarlac, and the naval and air installation at Subic, Zambales, and Clark, Pampanga. In the south, Davao received its first air raid on the same day. The Japanese planned to move swiftly and win victories before the United States respond with force. The Japanese landing at Lingayen brought Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese force in the Philippines. Manila was attacked as early as December 9, 1941. USAF, or United States Armed Forces in the Far East, retreated to Bataan and waited for reinforcement from the U.S. Uh, in January 2, 1942, the first Japanese contingent entered Manila and were cheered on as a liberator. Lieutenant General Homa declared the end of American rule in the Philippines and imposed martial law on all occupied areas. Japan martial law. Japan claimed that it was creating Asia for Asians. On January 3, 1942, General Masaharu Homa issued a proclamation announcing the end of the American occupation and the imposition of martial law in the country. The first order: surrender of firearms. Those who were still caught with weapons were detained at the dungeons of Fort Santiago and in other detention posts. Second, detention camps became places of torture. Third, priests suspected of engaging in subversion activities were also imprisoned. Fourth, as early as January 14, 1942, Colonel Murasawa issued a declaration to Christians in the Philippines. By 1943, parish priests were being required to use their pupils to convince the people that it was useless to resist Japanese rule. Fifth, General Homa allowed the laws, then enforced the Commonwealth to stay for the moment. He ordered all public officials to continue to discharge their duties. Sixth, curfew first from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Then, from 12 midnight to 6 a.m. 7. Total blackout was lifted on May 4, 1942, after the fall of Bataan. 8. Arbitrary arrests and executions were done by the Kempeitai or military police. Any time of the day. 9. Kura, most feared word. In word wave of Hadmin, come here, signified disaster, and outward wave of Hadmin, dismiss or scrum. 10. Many were also executed on mere suspicion of being with the resistance movement. 11. No one could travel without a pass from its army. This prohibition is travel was lifted after the fall of Corregidor. 12. Taliban La Vanguardia, Tribune, and Liwayway were allowed to continue publication but under rigid censorship by the government. 13. Many theaters switched from movies to stage shows. Next, life during wartime. Philippines was an occupied country. Means of production were under the control of the Japanese. And few banks were allowed to operate, and buying and selling became the source of income by the Filipinos. And Mickey Mouse money was circulated that provoked inflation in such alarming situation. Mickey Mouse money are these peso were affectionately named Mickey Mouse money by the Filipinos due to their value drastically decreased near the end of World War II. This peso was mostly likely issued near the end of World War II as 1,000 peso. 1,000 peso notes were needed due to hyperinflation. So, next, food shortage was alarming. Outbreak of epidemics were prevalent such as dysentery, malaria, and TB, causing death of many people. People live in constant fear and apprehension. Five mortal enemies of Filipinos are Japanese militaries, disease, guerrillas, hunger, and Japanese paid Filipinos. Kura. Kura is the most feared word inward wave of handmade come here and signified disaster, and outward wave of hand mean dismiss or scrum. Japanese encouraged the development of Tagalog and gave it an impetus never before witnessed. On April 9, 1942, the prisoners were disarmed and was told to march to Balanga. On April 10 to 15, 1942, from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell, 76,000 POWs were captured that March. During the main march, which lasted 5 to 10 days, depending on where a prisoner joined it, the captives were beaten, shot, bayoneted, and in many cases beheaded. A large number of those who made it to the camp later died of starvation and disease. On December 2, 1942, the Kalibapi or Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas, a non-political party, was established. Kalibapi's aim was to bring about the rapid reconstruction of the Philippines and the rehabilitation of the Filipino people. On June 19, 1943, Kalibapi members appointed a committee to nominate the members of the Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence or PCPI. When Laurel, Aquino, and Vargas returned to Manila from Tokyo, the government announced 2 days later the inauguration of the Republic of the Philippines would be on October 14. The Japanese worked for the enlistment of the Philippines into the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, reforming the Philippine government. The Second Republic of the Philippines. On June 19, 1943, Kalibapi, only political party that time, held a convention and elected 20 members of Preparatory Commission for Philippine Independence or PCPI. Please cancel Philippine independence as in charge of framing a constitution for the forthcoming republic, or to elect 54 members of the National Assembly, President Jose P. Laurel, Vice President Benigno Aquino Sr., Ramon Anansena. Next, inauguration. On October 14, 1943, on the steps of the Legislative Building in the Manila, our Philippine flag was hoisted as the national anthem was played. Meanwhile, Japanese who refused to cooperate with them hung giant posters and distributed their materials that contained slogans such as "The Philippines belong to the Filipinos." Also used newspapers, movies, and other to publicize the same idea. Promoting Japanese propaganda was one of the main objectives of the Kalibapi, but still, Japanese failed to gain the trust of the Filipinos. The puppet government. Although the Japanese had promised independence for the islands after occupation, they initially organized a council of state through which they directed civil affairs until October 1943. When they declared the Philippines an independent republic, the only one political party allowed during the occupation was the Japanese organized Kalibapi. During the occupation, most Filipinos remained loyal to the United States, and war crimes committed by forces of the Empire of Japan against surrendered Allied forces and civilians were documented. On the same day, the Philippine Executive Commission was established by the Japanese High Command, composed of Mr. Vargas as chairman, with other six Filipino department secretaries, namely Benigno S. Aquino, the Commissioner of the Interior, Antonio de las Aras, the Finance, Jose P. Laurel, in Justice, Rafael Alunan, Agriculture and Commerce, Claro M. Recto, in Education, Health, and Public Welfare, and last, Quintin Paredes, in Public Works and Communication. The new constitution noticeably lacked a Bill of Rights, contained 12 articles lifted from the 1935 Constitution that fitted the wishes of the Japanese. Was meant to be in effect only temporarily, while the Philippines still in chaos. On September 4, 1943, Constitution was brought to the public, and on September 7, 1943, ratification of the Japanese-sponsored Constitution, Preamble, and 12 articles. On October 14, 1943, the inauguration of the Second Philippine Republic. However, this puppet republic was not taken seriously by the people as well as the international community. Laurel and the rest of Filipino leaders served as puppet of the Japanese authorities, for real executive and legislative powers lay on the hands of the Japanese military leaders. And the problem of the republic is during his term in office, Laurel was faced with various problems that the country was experiencing, such as the following: shortages of food, clothing, oil, and other necessities, heavy Japanese military presence throughout the entire region, Japanese control of transportation, media, and communications. The resistance. Japanese occupation of the Philippines was opposed by active and successful underground and guerrilla activity that increased over the years and that eventually covered a large portion of the country. The Philippine guerrilla movement continued to grow in spite of Japanese campaigns against them. The island of Mindanao being farthest from the center of Japanese occupation had 38,000 guerrillas who were eventually consolidated under the command of American civil engineer Colonel Wendell Fertig. And next, one resistance group in the central zone area was known as the Hukbalaha, Hukbo ng Bayan kalaban sa Hapon, and or the People's Anti-Japanese Army, organized in early 1942 under the leadership of Luis Taruk, a Communist Party member since 1939. And Yusa forces in Bataan continued to oppose the Japanese. They withstood the attacks of the enemy, delayed General Holmes' timetable. The expected capture of the Philippines in 60 days lasted for 3 months. And there was also resistance in Panay and Mindanao. On March 1942, um, President Quezon and his family were evacuated from Corregidor to Australia. He left Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos as acting president in case he and Vice President Osmeña were killed or captured by the Japanese. Quezon was later brought to the US where he set up a government in exile in Washington. And next, DANAS, or District and Neighborhood Associations. Organized by Chairman Vargas on August 8, 1942, it provides means of self-protection to the local residents. Next, the Hooks, or the people or the member of Hook Balahap, agreed to fight the Japanese as a unified guerrilla army. Farmers of Pampanga banded together and created local brigades for their protection. Luis Taruk, Juan Pelio, and Castro Alejandrino, they agreed to call their organization Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa mga Hapon or Hukbalahap. Luis Taruk was the leader and Alejandrino was the right hand, or members were simply called the Hooks. Next, the return of MacArthur. On October 20, 1944, MacArthur waded ashore onto the Philippine island of Leyte. That day, he made a radio broadcast in which he declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." In January 1945, his forces invaded the main Philippine island of Luzon. In February, Japanese forces at Bataan were cut off, and Corregidor was captured. Manila, the Philippine capital, fell in March, and in June, MacArthur announced his offensive operations on Luzon to be at an end. In August, although scattered Japanese resistance continued until the end of the war. In August, only one-third of the men MacArthur left behind in March 1942 survived to see his return. And he said, "I'm a little late," he told them, "but we finally came." At last, surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945. By the end of July 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was incapable of conducting operations, and an Allied invasion of Japan was imminent. Japan was persuading the Soviet to mediate peace that is favorable to Japan, while the Soviet was secretly planning to attack Japan. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. And on August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And on August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded the Imperial Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. Later that same day, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito to intervene and order the Big Six to accept the terms for ending the war that the Allies had set down in the Potsdam Declaration. The surrender ceremony was held on September 2, aboard the United States Navy battleship USS Missouri BB-63, at which officials from the Japanese government signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender, thereby ending the hostilities in World War II. The state of war between Japan and the Allies formally ended. The Treaty of San Francisco came into force on April 28, 1952. Four more years passed before Japan and the Soviet Union signed the Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration of 1956, which formally brought an end to their state of war. Again, good morning, and that's all. Thank you.